Hello and welcome to this next episode of Artful Loving. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about trauma and how we can be with trauma, both our own and our partners, in intimate relationship. Hi there folks, I'm Nick Tovey, relationships and intimacy counsellor, coach, educator and author of the book The Revolutionary Man, which of course you can find on Amazon. If you want to know a little bit more about me, you can go and visit my website nicktovey.com. And of course, if you're new to the channel, please go ahead, click that subscribe button, the notification bell, so you're going to find out when new videos come your way. It's really important that for me to be able to get this work out there, I really need your support. So I really want and implore you and beg you, if you think that this is valuable content and information that I can get out to as many people as possible, then please click that subscribe button, like it, share it with your friends. The more activity that I get from you on the channel and on the videos, it shows up more. That's just the way the internet works, is we need activity, I need activity, and I really want to feel like you're engaging with me in this conversation. So please give me your comments, your questions, anything that you want to share about your own experiences. And of course, if you've got particularly interesting topics or things that you're struggling with, then let me know so I can talk about and give you my perspective on it. So you can do that down in the comments, or you can contact me directly via email. So trauma's a big subject. It's a big word, and it's quite a buzzword today in our popular culture, in our psychology. There's a lot of emphasis on working with trauma, understanding trauma, and getting information out there so people can work in a trauma-informed way. These are very important subjects to be clued in on, not only from our own perspective to understand the things that may have happened to us and how they impact us, but also how we can understand each other and how we can relate to each other, how we can see there's maybe somebody's in an emotional trigger. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe there's something going on under the surface that we're not aware of, that we can't see. So that's really important. Because it is such a buzzword and such a very up in the society topic, of course there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of stuff that isn't really helpful. People talking about it that really don't have the expertise. Not that I claim to be the expert, but it is a subject that I've not only had my own personal experience with. I've done a lot of work with in my education and a lot of work with clients, so I do have some level of experience with. And of course, I don't know everything, but it is a subject that I'm very, very interested in because it's bloody important, particularly when we're talking about intimate relationships. Intimate relationships is often where these experiences that we've had, these negative experiences, these traumas, and we'll get into how we can define that a little clearer in a little while, but these are heavily triggered in relationship because there's so much at stake. We're meeting somebody at a heart level, hopefully, and of course that's scary. It scares the fuck out of us, and it points to these little insecurities or wounds that we may have experienced earlier in our life that have caused us to have certain fears around it, around intimacy, around closeness, around what it is to be with somebody who's that close and we may depend on to some degree. And of course, these traumas get triggered and we get all heated and our emotional state escalates to the point where we're not very good at communicating, and then we end up in conflict and we end up disrupting connection and potentially dissolving the relationship because trauma's been activated. That's even if we allow ourselves to have relationship, because one very common way of coping with early childhood trauma or trauma is to avoid relationship, to avoid intimacy, to not even allow ourselves or anybody else to get close to us in case these things get triggered, in case our wounds get activated, in case we get hurt again. It's really, really important to be aware of this, to be aware of our own inner workings, so we know how it plays out in relationship. So what is trauma? Very simply defined, trauma is a wound that we experience through a significant injury. And of course, that can be a physical injury. Yeah, we can have trauma to an arm when we cut it, or we break a leg. That's a physical trauma. It may not. We may get a scar from it, but we may not necessarily be traumatized in a psychological context. Yeah. So what we really wanted to talk about here is psychological trauma, is the wound that occurs to our psyche, and that it has a lasting impact on how we defend ourselves and how we show up in the world. So of course these wounds are much more difficult to define when we're talking about psychological wound. It's very easy to define, here's a cut on my arm, that's a wound, that's a trauma. Yeah. But when we have an experience that happens to us, and we then have a psychological wounding in response to that experience, it's much more difficult to see that. We can't put it under a microscope and examine it. It's very difficult. And of course, this is the nature of psychology. It's a very challenging science to experiment with, to understand, because yes, we're knowing so much more about it in recent times, and of course our knowledge and understanding of psychology is increasing all the time, which is beautiful, but it's still a relatively new subject, and our ability to understand neurology is very, very new when we're talking about using MRI scans to be able to see what goes on in the brain under different circumstances. This is very new technology. So we're learning so much about it lately. Anyway, something that I really love, I remember hearing from a great teacher that I highly respect and therapist called Gabor Mate. He's an expert on addiction and trauma, and he talks about, one of the quotes that I really love from him is that trauma isn't something that happens to us, it's how we respond to what happens to us. So I really love that. Trauma isn't something that happens to us, it's how we respond to what happens to us. And that's really, really true. That's very, very clear. One event is going to have a different impact on one person versus the next person. When you look at twin studies and sibling studies that may have grown up in very, very similar environments, not all of the children respond to the same traumas that they may have been subjected to in the same way. So it's very subjective. It's very individual, and like I said, it's not like something we can put under a microscope. Yes, through fMRI scans and different measurements, we can see how the brain works, how a traumatized brain works in comparison to a non-traumatized brain works. But it's really we can learn a lot from that, but it's still very early days, and as far as being able to fully understand the mechanisms that go on. More than just being able to observe the neurology, what else is really important, and again, this is something we've discovered much more in the last 10, 15, 20 years is that trauma isn't just a psychological thing. It isn't something that just happens in the brain. It happens in the body also. And you can definitely read more about this with the work of Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine. The Body Keeps the Score is a fantastic book, where we're really talking about the somatic experiences, the bodily experiences of trauma. A lovely analogy I like to use, and I think I may have got this from one of these books, is that when you look at a gazelle running through the savannah in Africa being chased by a lion, obviously that lion is looking for dinner, the gazelle is wanting not to be dinner and is trying to get the hell away from that lion as quickly as possible. The fight or flight response is very, very active in that gazelle, as it does for us when we're facing potential danger. Just exactly the same mechanism. Where that gazelle gets away from the lion, maybe it just outruns the lion gives up, lies down, has a rest, starts nibbling on some grass. The gazelle just looks around, aha, I'm safe, shakes the body, and then he's fine. He walks off. He doesn't sit there cowering, thinking about the event that just happened. He doesn't get post-traumatic stress disorder. The gazelle just gets on with life. So what's he done? He shook off the experience of trauma. Yeah, this is something that we know now is a very innate, natural response to trauma. It's how our body wants to respond when we feel trauma. We shake. Yeah, the body shakes. Often when we go into shock, the body shakes. It's actually very, very natural for us to do that. What often happens in, say, you've had an accident and the ambulance comes, or you've been hit by mum, and you want to cry and scream and what often happens is that those movements, those expressions of that trauma get suppressed, get shut down. So it doesn't leave the body, it stays in the body. So we have this interplay between neurology and physiology, and then of course psychology as well. Yeah, because we create, at the times when we have the trauma, we create perceptions, we create an understanding of the event, of ourself, of the world, and that imprint, that psychological imprint, sort of sits within our psyche and our brain and our body, and it's like this imprint that we then have, that whenever something like the original trauma comes along, the original wounding comes along, or threatens to be like that original wounding, it's like it rings the alarm bells. Yeah, it rings the alarm bells and tells us we're in danger. We may not necessarily be in danger, but that's not what our primitive parts of the brain and the body are telling us. It is, the alarm bells are going off. The amygdala at the core of our brain is like the alarm system, the danger system, and it's firing off. It's shooting all of the chemicals into our bloodstream, like adrenaline, cortisol. It's getting the big muscles ready to fight or flight, ready to act, ready to keep ourselves safe. And this is what gets activated when we end up being in high conflict situations with our partner. Something gets triggered, activated, fight or flight, poof, or run. Yeah, and run could look, maybe not a physical run, it could be a withdrawing into oneself. Yeah, it often shows up differently for different people. So if we come back to what I said about what Gabor Mate says about trauma not being what happens to us, but how we respond to it. It's a very, very important thing, which I want to dive into a little more. What else Gabor Mate says, and I've seen this and heard this from a few different teachers, therapists, is that there's trauma exists on a spectrum, and there's big T trauma and there's little t trauma. I'm not personally a fan of the big T, little t description, because I feel like it creates a little bit of or it creates the potential for some hierarchy between, you know, my trauma is bigger than your trauma, which can be problematic, can end up undermining people's personal experiences. And this is the reality of it, is that trauma is subjective. Trauma is very much about that person's, that individual's experience, no matter when they experienced what they experienced and what it was that they experienced. Yeah. So of course, up one end of the spectrum, we have trauma like war, like sexual abuse, like rape, like watching or seeing or witnessing a murder. You know, like all these experiences are extremely traumatic. Does everybody respond to them with the same reaction? Of course not. Yeah, but there's probably more likelihood that people are going to have a very big response to those experiences. Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, this is where it gets a little more interesting in some degrees, because we need to take a few different factors into account. It's very clear, you know, those big experiences that I've just mentioned, they're very obvious what they are. We can see that is a traumatic event, yeah, and a really unpleasant experience to go through. But down the other end of the spectrum, the experiences can be much more subtle, but the response to them can be just as big as the ones up the other end. Yeah, this is what's very interesting when we're talking about trauma. So down the other end of the spectrum, let's say, as an example, as a child, as an infant, I'm a child who depends on my parents for love, for connection, for life, you know, and the removal of connection and love really means death to me. So if I fully depend on let's say my mother, and of course the same goes for father too, but literally I'm dependent on mother for food as well as nurturance and safety. I can have that from my father as well. I just don't get the food bit. Okay, so if I'm that infant and mum, for some reason, is tired, frustrated, angry, she's had enough of sleepless nights, God forbid, and she gets a little gruff with me when I'm crying. And she growls, she may not even do anything, but I can feel the tension in her body, and she puts me down on the cot, maybe a little firmer than she would normally, and she walks out on me, leaves me in my room, in my cot, in my crib, to cry. Yeah, this is a very common experience that I'm sure many of us have had as children, and so for that child, in that child's very limited powers of deduction, they recognize that they've been abandoned. Yeah, that mother has walked out on me. I am now abandoned. What does abandonment mean to a child, to an infant? It means death. And so that can be enough to create a trauma in that child, in that infant's neurology, in their body, in their psyche, to tell them, okay, if I cry, we'll come into the adaptations, the changes that we do in a little while. So that in itself can be an experience of trauma to that infant. That is going to have lasting implications on that child as they grow up, as they develop, as they become adults and start to relate with people in an intimate way. Who's got an abandonment wound that they may have? Maybe when your partner leaves you in a conflict situation, they walk out and something happens in your body and you feel like you're being left, you're about to die. Yeah, and that triggers you in a really big way. That's not to say what they've done is a good thing. It's not. But the response, the reaction that you're having to it is extreme. Yeah. Or your partner looks at another woman or man in a way that doesn't feel very good to you, and you get really extremely triggered by that. Yeah, jealousy can be the result of previous trauma, abandonment. So often these experiences like the one I've just described are what we call attachment wounds, or attachment trauma, or attachment disruption, depending on what you're reading and who you're listening to. But essentially that means the same thing. Yeah, it's a wounding that occurs in early childhood that disrupts the attachment between infant and parent. And so this is a particular branch of trauma work, which is very distinct, and of course at the moment, and you've probably heard all about it all over social media and in different formats, this is very up at the moment, and a lot of people talking about attachment wounding and how it plays out in relationship, and it's a really big deal. It's very useful and informative for us to be able to understand our early childhood experiences and the ways in which we may have had some attachment disruption, but most importantly, how it now affects me and impacts me in life and in my relationships. Really, really important. I'm feeling like I don't want to get too deep into attachment theory right now, because it's a big subject, and I feel like it may be worth doing an episode on attachment theory alone. But I want to just sort of introduce it as a concept on this spectrum of trauma that I'm talking about. Yeah, and it can be extreme. The impacts of attachment wounding can be very, very extreme, very problematic, and can cause all sorts of problems in relationship. So that they do exist more down the to use the nomenclature that I don't particularly like, down the small t end of the spectrum, because they're not necessarily big wounding events. They can be, but they're not always, like the one I just described. That, from our eyes, from an adult's eyes, doesn't look like anything, but to a child it's huge. Yeah, so this is where we come back to, we have to understand that this is a subjective experience, and so this person's reaction to their experience is theirs, and it's really important that we don't undermine it, we don't minimize it, we don't shame them for having that reaction. Particularly in a case where it's early childhood trauma, we need to be able to see through the eyes of the child to fully understand what it felt like for them, which is not very easy to do as the adult, particularly if it's our own experience. Yeah, and I see this a lot with clients that I work with, is often they have difficulty owning and admitting to the experiences that they've had as early children, and equating that to being traumatic, to being a trauma, to being a wounding, until we get deeper into it and start to tease it apart and see how we then start to make adaptations to the trauma, which we'll go into in a second. So attachment wounding, attachment disruption occurs when that very, very important bond between parent and child is disrupted in some way. And this could be for many reasons. It could be that the parents just aren't very present. They're not very affectionate and loving to the child. It could be that the parents are potentially aggressive towards the child, and there's yelling and experiences that cause strong fear in that child. It could be, of course, it could be abusive experiences where we do have physical or potentially sexual abuse that happens in those early, very important formative years of the child. And we're talking about a period of time, the very important period of time where these woundings really get implanted, is anywhere throughout that perinatal period, so throughout particularly later term pregnancy, through birth, of course, when we're looking at traumatic births, that can have a really strong impact on the child's body neurology, on their trauma systems. Yeah. And then of course those early days throughout early infancy up to around 5, these are very formative times when this young person is creating their idea of what the world's like and how I need to behave in the world, and who I am as an individual, who I am, what my worth is, what my value is, yeah, and how to get love, how to get what I need in order to survive. So of course, you've heard me talk about adaptation. This is the experience that we have post-trauma, where we adjust and respond to the world. Yeah, we're gonna change who we are and how we behave, and in order to protect ourselves from having that experience again. It's like, oh shit, I don't want to go down that road again. That hurt. That was really unpleasant. How do I change? How do I adjust? How do I adapt to the world in order to prevent that from happening, to avoid that experience? It could be things as simple as, if in the example I had before, crying causes, or the deduction that the child makes, that the infant makes with a very limited ability to deduce, they deduce that if I cry, mummy gets angry, shoves me in the cot, walks away, abandons me. Okay, maybe I won't cry. Maybe I'll try something different. Yeah, it's not a very conscious thought that's happening, but this is very much what's going on for this infant. So I'll shove down my emotions. I'll suppress myself. I'll keep quiet. I'll smile. I'll be a nice kid. Yeah, and these are all the ways in which we start to adjust who we are and how we show up in order to get love, keep ourselves safe. How many of you have had these experiences where you've noticed yourself in relationships sort of undermining your own needs in order to please the other person? Pretty common, yeah. Even though what I want may be something totally different, but I don't want this person to get angry. I don't want them to abandon me. I don't want them to walk away and leave me. I don't want this attachment to be disrupted. So I'm going to adjust myself in order to please the other person. Familiar? Of course, we've all done it to some degree. Another adaptation is like, I don't trust that I'm going to get what I want from these people, from adults. So I'm going to deduce that I'll just need to look after myself and become autonomous, become a bit quiet and subdued and a little bit avoidant of attachment, of connection. And how many of you have had that experience in a relationship where we get a little close and then, okay, I'm checking out. This is too scary. Who's been in a relationship with someone who's done that? Yeah. So these are very common adaptations that happen with these early childhood experiences. So how do we know if we or our partner have some trauma? Yeah, have some trauma that is at play in our relationship. There are certain signs that we want to look out for. I just mentioned a couple, being avoidant and being what we call ambivalently attached, where we try to please the other person. If I'm a people pleaser and I'm trying to I undermine my own needs. These are fairly they're not insignificant, and they're extremely have extreme impacts in relationships, but they're not necessarily going to cause, or at least in their early phases, they're not necessarily going to cause great problems for us. Yeah, they can definitely be really significant and have a big impact on relationship. But what I think, when we're looking at traumas from more up the bigger end of the spectrum, the big T end of the spectrum, I still struggle with it. But it's useful to a degree, if you take my meaning. Yeah, I think it's important that we don't create hierarchies, and we don't, go into my trauma is better than your trauma, which is an interesting conversation to get into as well when we're talking about that. So we're up the big T end of the spectrum. Sometimes these embodied experiences can look like extreme fight, flight, or the third F, which is freeze. So a freeze response, and this is very common with people that have experienced potentially early childhood, but not necessarily early childhood, but sexual abuse or strong physical abuse, when we've been in a very, very unsafe situation. A freeze response is a way that our psyche sort of takes us out of the experience. If I know by fighting, let's say I am a child and I'm being abused by an adult who's much stronger than me, I know that fighting against this person is futile. It's probably going to get me more traumatized. I'm going to get into bigger trouble. So what do? My only option is to disappear. My consciousness disappears, and this is what we call freeze. It's dissociation. Yeah. And so we have the fight response, which is escalated, highly attacking, wanting to create safety, get that danger away by any means. So fight, flight, which is run away, get out of the situation. That can be an avoidant experience where it's like, I just don't want to be in relationship, I'm walking away, this is all too hard. It can also be withdrawal within oneself. Yeah, it's not speaking up, not offering a perspective to avoid conflict. It's some ways in which we check out. We're not necessarily dissociating like in the freeze response, but we're just checking out. We're disrupted. We're in ourself, and it's like we go into our own little cocoon. And then, of course, the freeze response, which is where consciousness has disappeared, and the person can look very, very normal, very present. They can look like they've just checked out, but it's like you look into the eyes. There's no one home. So, of course, we all have emotional reactions to things. We all gonna get emotional to certain, in response and reaction to certain situations and certain behaviors and certain circumstances. Yeah. But what we're talking about here is the extreme, heightened states of emotionality where we've lost control. Yeah. So if this is a repetitive experience for you, it's quite likely that there's some underlying trauma. If you have any of those three experiences that I just described before, and that's repetitive for you, you see it come up in certain circumstances, then that's very clearly indicating and pointing towards that you've got some unresolved trauma sitting somewhere. So it's very worthwhile going and doing some work with a good psychotherapist, a psychologist, somebody you relate with, somebody you feel that you can do some good work with. We can't, and I don't like the terminology that often gets used when we say we can heal from trauma. I personally don't feel like we can heal from trauma. What we can do is learn to live with it. We can have the trauma not have power over us. Yeah, we can gain our own sense of empowerment and understanding around what's happened to us and how we've reacted to it, and learn new ways of responding and strategies that we put into place so we don't react in that hypervigilant, traumatized state. But it's like, like a wound on the arm. If I get cut on my arm, I'm going to get a scar, and that scar remains. And the body regenerates its cells, but it still regenerates scar cells to tell me, here I had a trauma. I had a wounding. And yes, it doesn't hurt anymore. And yes, it's not bleeding anymore. So the wound isn't open, and causing me pain all the time, but there's still a wound there. Yeah, and the same happens when we're talking about trauma. Of course, we can't look at the brain and say there's the scar. I wish we could, it'd be much easier, but the reality is the scar's there in the psyche, in the neurology, in the body, and it will get opened and triggered in certain situations. So we can work to reduce that trigger and to the point where it may not ever happen again. You know, I've definitely experienced that myself to some degree. But we can't get rid of the experiences that we've had in our past. Yeah, they're part of our story, part of our makeup, and they're part of us. And so to try and, I don't know, take it away, take it out of our story would be a disservice in some ways. Yeah, I think we can learn to make those experiences work for us and be something that we can grow from rather than be powered by. Yeah. So if you're in relationship with somebody who may be exhibiting some of these reactions that I've talked about, it's important to recognize it and to notice it. And what's really, really important is to understand that it's not about you. Yes, you may have done something that's triggered a wound, but that wound was there way before you, or most likely, yeah. It's something that exists in that person and they need to do some work with. And of course, you can support them in that. You can do what you can to have compassion and understanding for what's going on there and to really try to understand what they feel, what they're experiencing, what it is that you potentially do in order to trigger that wound, so you can maybe adjust your language, adjust the way you speak or the tone of voice that you use or the behavior that you exhibit. Yeah, so these are ways we want to compassionately understand each other and not necessarily pander to their wound and their trauma. We don't want to do that. That's not helpful to anybody. But we can definitely be understanding, be compassionate, and support them to get the work that they need to do so they can regain their power. I mentioned it in the last episode about communication. Is sometimes, you know, when our traumas are activated, there is no communication that's going to go anywhere good. It just doesn't work. That person cannot hear you. They cannot function. If they're activated and they're fully in their trauma reaction, there's no getting any words in. So everything that you say is going to feel like an attack. So time out. Do not try and communicate. Do not try and resolve a conflict when we've got extreme emotion present, when our trauma's been activated. Really, really clear, simple tool. Just don't do it. It may be useful, in fact, it's very useful to have a conversation with each other in a state when you're not triggered, when you're not traumatized, when you're not in a highly emotional state, but when you're in a beautiful place, when you're connected, you're in a space of mutual connection. Create some agreements around how to behave when you know, if I have this experience when I get really triggered by something and I become irrational and start throwing things around the house, the worst thing you can do is yell at me, because when you yell at me, I get heightened and then I'm terrified in that situation and I'm trying to protect myself. It's as extreme, yeah, but it happens. So what's the best way that I can connect with you when you're in that state? Maybe you need to talk to me calmly. Maybe you need to come up and give me a hug. Maybe you just need to put your hand on my heart and look at me and let me know that I'm okay. Yeah, these are the things that we can do to support each other. We're not caretaking. We're not pandering to each other's victimhood and wounding. But what we are doing is supporting each other to deregulate. So this is co-regulation. We're helping each other deregulate so we can then cope, we can deal, we can resolve a thing that may need to be resolved, and we can, of course, feel better. And of course, I can't stress this enough. Get some support. Yeah, it's super important. Your partner shouldn't be your therapist. Yeah, that's not their role. It's not who they should be. Of course, we want our partner to be understanding and to be caring and all of those things, but we don't want our partner to be our therapist. Go and find your therapist. If this is you, if I'm talking to stuff that really resonates, that you can see, there's stuff going on for me, get some help. If you feel like you want to work with me, you can totally do that. Connect with me if you feel that I'm the right person for you, but I may not be. Yeah, so you find the right person for you. There's plenty of online therapy platforms you can use if it's difficult to get to a place. But of course, there are benefits from being in a room with somebody, and for some people that works really well. Sometimes Zoom sessions work really well. I do a lot of Zoom therapy calls. So it's very, very worthwhile going and doing some work. Yes, it may not be comfortable. Yes, it could be hard at times. But on the other side of that, you're going to be a much better version of yourself, and you're going to feel much better. And you'll be a much better person to be in relationship with. So if this has been useful to you, please do the likey, the sharey, the subscribey thing. Let your friends know this could be useful for them. Yeah, this is such a really, really important topic, and I've skimmed the surface, but what I've given, what I've offered, I think is a good beginning place to gain some understanding of maybe what's going on for you or your partner or a friend or family member. So do the clicky thing. And I'd love to connect with you. If you've got any questions, comments, please put them in the comments below. All right, you take care, keep loving.